Thank you so much for joining us today for a virtual tour of the Black Mecca Museum in Chatham, Ontario. Today, the president of our board of directors, Dorothy Wallace, will be showing you around the museum, and the voiceovers will be done by our executive director-curator, myself, Samantha Meredith. We hope you enjoy it and learn a little bit more about this important piece of Canadian history. Now, let's get into the start of our story.
The story of the Chatham Black community started in 1780. We had a lady by the name of Sally Ames, an Oneida woman who was a fur trader, and she had a slave that she owned by the name of Frank. This was in 1780. Sally Ames bought land. Her land was from Dover Center to Chatham. She brought Frank, who helped clear and cultivate her land. Therefore, we know that Frank was the first black slave in Chatham.
Since our part of Canada at this time was part of the British Empire, it meant that slavery was legal throughout our areas. It wasn't until 1833 when the Slavery Abolitionist Act was written and would come into effect on August 1st, 1834, that slavery would be abolished in our areas. We hear so often in our history about the stories of Canada being the freedom land for fugitive slaves, but it's always a good reminder that we also had enslaved peoples on the places we call home. When black families began coming to the Chatham area, they would settle along McGregor's Creek, which is actually just behind our museum. This gave them a source of water that could be used not only for everyday things, but also for transportation if they need it. One of the earliest black settlers to settle along the creek was a man by the name of Sherwood Barber. He arrived in the Chatham area sometime in the 1830s. He would end up building a bridge across McGregor's Creek, which was actually the first bridge to be built in the city. Eventually, that bridge would be carried away by a flood, but this black community member unknowingly made history when he built the bridge across McGregor's Creek. The image we see here today is actually an early Chatham postcard of McGregor's Creek. Many of Chatham's early black community was a mix of fugitive slaves and free black people running away from the Fugitive Slave Act in the United States. The Jones family has an interesting story of how they came to Canada. Here in the picture, we have James Monroe Jones, who was an early Chatham gunsmith, but he was born enslaved in North Carolina. His family story is a bit different, as they didn't escape from slavery, but they actually purchased their freedom. James's father, Allen, made a deal with his slave master that he could purchase the freedom of his entire family. They made a deal that $2,000 would be enough. So Allen, who would have to work outside of his tasks as a slave to earn and save the money, did just that. He worked as a blacksmith and gunsmith, earning extra cash. He went to his owner with the money and was told that the $2,000 was no longer enough and now needed $3,000. Swindled, Allen kept working hard and saved up that money and was able to purchase their freedom. Him and his family would settle in Oberlin, Ohio afterwards, where he would then send all his sons to college to gain an education. His son, James Monroe Jones, would come to the Chatham area, where he became a gunsmith. We often refer to him as Gunsmith Jones. He was such a skilled gunsmith and engraver that he won multiple awards for his craftsmanship. Sometimes, though, once they found out that the guns were made by a black man, the awards would be taken back. Gunsmith's brother, William, would go on to settle out in British Columbia. He actually became the first licensed dentist out there, and he gained the nickname Painless Jones. The Jones family would continue to make history, including one of Gunsmith Jones's daughters.
Sophie Jones is Gunsmith Jones' daughter. She was born and raised here in the city of Chatham. She had always wanted to become a doctor, but before she reached her goal to be the doctor, she went to school in Toronto, came back and was a teacher, then still had that dream of becoming a doctor. She went to Michigan and got her degrees. She is the first Black female doctor in Michigan. A girl from Chatham. Sophie is one of my favorite people in my history here at the museum. Just think, a girl from Chatham becoming the first Black female doctor of Michigan, born and raised in Chatham. There were 6 Black doctors in 1855 here in the city of Chatham. One of these doctors was Dr. Delaney, who was an abolitionist, an author, and also here there was an epidemic when he came here, and he stopped it dead in its tracks. Sophie, we already mentioned. Then Dr. Ruffin Abbott was also one of the doctors that was here in the city of Chatham. He was one of the early coroners of Chatham.
This here is Henry Weaver. Henry and his wife Annie were both born enslaved in the United States and had one daughter named Caroline. They decided that they were going to escape the bonds of slavery on foot. Family history tells us that at one time on their journey to freedom, Henry even hid under his wife's skirt to avoid detection on their escape. Eventually, they would arrive in the city of Chatham. Once here, Henry and Annie gained employment and would even start their own businesses. Gaining a loan, they would purchase the building at the corner of Park and Duke Street in the city and would renovate the property to suit their entrepreneurial dreams. Henry would run a butcher shop and grocery shop on the bottom floor, and Annie would run a boarding house above and take in laundry. Annie had no trouble getting guests for their boarding house, as the downtown hotels remained segregated at this time. Henry would eventually build a smokehouse at the rear of the store and was soon after known to smoke some of the best hams in the city. Annie would also take on serving meals as an additional source of income for the family. Henry, being involved in many of the happenings of the city, even became the city's second Black city councilor in 1891. The first was Isaac Holden. As a couple, they became one of the most affluent Black families in the community and began to own several properties around the town. Today, their original house still stands at the corner of Park Street and Duke Street and is turned into apartments. For many years, the building remained as a grocery and corner store in the community. There's a park across the street as well, named after him.
He did have Black-owned blocks in the city of Chatham. They were Hunton and Charity and the Murray and Boyd blocks.
One of the Black-owned blocks that Dorothy mentioned was the Charity Block. It was located at the corner of King and Adelaide Street in the city of Chatham. It was owned by James Charity and was home to a few different businesses. James owned the Great Western Boot and Shoe Store in the block. From an early advertisement in 1854, he advertised for a complete stock of gentlemen, ladies, and children's shoes of every description, boots, shoes, and everything in good line. The Charity Block was also more famously home to the Provincial Freeman newspaper during its time in the city of Chatham. Published from 1853 until 1857, with some copies still being published into the 1860s, the Provincial Freeman, a weekly newspaper, advocated for equality, integration, and self-sufficiency for the Black community in Canada and the USA. Mary Ann Shadd, best known as an educator, abolitionist, suffragist, and early feminist, was the first Black female newspaper publisher in North America when she published the Provincial Freeman newspaper. The story of Mary Ann Shadd is shared within the museum, but it's actually shared throughout the entire East Side community of Chatham as well.
We have lots of monuments and things throughout the neighborhood of Mary Ann Shadd. This is just one throughout our neighborhood that you can find inside the Wish Center.
You can also find plaques on Mary Ann Shadd outside of the Wish Center, down at the King Street Variety Store block, and over at our BME Freedom Park.
In Chatham, in the early 1850s, Chatham's whites would not allow the Blacks to go to the schools. So the Blacks decided to build their own schools, which everyone could go to. These schools were well known for their for trade, for getting you ready to go to university, and also they taught you a trade. These were some of the earliest schools in the day.
First up, we have the Wilberforce Educational Institute. It was opened in 1873 in a standard frame building. The creation of this school was from the merger of two institutions, the British American Institute at the Don Settlement and the Nazarene Institute. The school was founded at the corner of Princess and Wellington Street in Chatham. The purpose of the school was to furnish the youth of the area, regardless of race, color, creed, or nationality, not only with a sound primary and secondary education, but with a far superior education that would set them up for the university level. Other schools in the city of Chatham often would deny entrance to the members of the Black community, but as the Black community built their own schools, they would not have the same regulations and would open their doors to anyone. The original board of trustees for the school included Reverend Richard Disney, Morris Potter, Stanton Hunton, Isaac Holden, Nelson Robinson, Nathaniel Murray, and Perry F. Chase. The curriculum at the time would include examinations in art, law, and medicine for the students, and would also prepare students for careers in teaching and business. The school's first president was actually Dr. Anderson Ruffin Abbott, the first Canadian-born Black doctor. The first group of pupils to attend the school numbered around 100 students. 36 of those were enrolled in the preparatory classes, and about 20 were enrolled in the primary classes. Teachers and principals at the school over the years were the best of the best, including Principal Alfred Lafferty, a graduate from University of Toronto, Dolly Scott, Lillian Shreve, and Molly Lewis, to name a few. The school eventually moved to King Street in 1887 and was described at the time as a handsome brick structure located near the CPR station. That building would remain until it was demolished in 1952, even though the school closed in the mid-1890s. The picture you see here is of that school that would have been located on King Street East. Though there were other schools built by the Black community, one of the other most notable ones was the Woodstock Industrial Institute. It was established in 1908 with the purchase of the former King Street School building. The purpose of this school was to establish an institution to help supplement the waning skilled labor force in the area. Though the Woodstock Industrial Institute was established and administered by the Black community, they proposed that their school not exclude the Indigenous or white community. Some of the courses offered at the Institute included blacksmithing, music, dressmaking, nickel plating, and radio technology. By 1927, though, the Institute would close its doors. It was the same year that the building would then become known as the J.G. Taylor Community Center, named for one of its original members, Reverend J.G. Taylor. The community center ran for 6 decades and was home to many community groups. By 1984, the building was demolished, but the park, with the same namesake as the community center, Taylor Park, remains today.
Like our schools, the churches were very, very important to us. They were our meeting place. They were a cornerstone to all of the young people coming up to guide us and to let us know the opportunities that we had to go to become better citizens.
Just like the schools, the churches in Chatham were also segregated, so the community built their own. The BME Church came into existence in Chatham, Ontario in 1856 under Willis Nasry, the first bishop of the local church. The Victoria Chapel was finished being built by 1857 on the corner of Princess Street. When the church began to flourish, it outgrew its structure, and by 1910 they had built the new brick structure. During a period in the 1930s until 1958, the church left the BME conference and became known as the Community Church. By 1958, it rejoined the conference and kept its doors open until 1980. The building remained until the death of its last church member, Eula Curley, who passed away in 1988. The building was demolished in 1989.
One of my stories that I like to tell of the BME Church, which then I called the Community Church, was their Thanksgiving dinner that the ladies of the church did. They would make the meals and we would deliver them to the homes on Thanksgiving Day. The women of the homes did not have to cook that day because of the ladies of the church. This was how they made their money, so they could take care of the sick and needs of the community. After the church was torn down, we were lucky enough to receive the Bible from the church. Down at the bottom here, you will see the stool that was used at the organ bench. Along the sides, you will see cornerstones naming the name of the very first church, Victoria, the cornerstone, 1857. And also, we have the stained glass window.
Another early Black church in the community was the First Baptist Church. The Chatham one first appeared in 1845 in the Amherstburg Baptist Association records, with Stephen White as the pastor. Membership at the time only numbered 9 people. The next pastor of the church was Elder Hawkins. He was born enslaved in Kentucky and eventually settled in Amherstburg and then come to the Chatham area. His first order of business when he came to head the First Baptist Church in Chatham was to build a new church. The building was then completed on King Street East in Chatham in 1853, where the church is still today. The First Baptist Church still actually serves the local Chatham community and celebrates their long legacy in the Abolitionist movement. And another church that still stands in the community today, built by the Black community, is the AME Church.
AME Church always made it possible for the young people of this neighborhood every summer, the 1st of August, to go to Blue Island or Spring Banks or the Detroit Zoo, to make it possible for them to have something in their summer. We had a lot of organizations here and groups in the city of Chatham. They were the Shriners, the Knight Templars, Buds of Promise, the Masons, and the Eastern Stars, just to name a few.
Of those groups locally, St. John's Lodge number 9 still exists, and their building stands beside our BME Freedom Park at the corner of Princess and Wellington Street here in town. The abolitionist movement in Chatham was huge. One man that came to the city of Chatham who is most known around the world is John Brown. Let's have Dorothy tell us a little bit about him.
John Brown held his convention at the First Baptist Church on King Street here in Chatham. He was here to get the men to help him to get this end of slavery.
So when Dorothy mentions he came to Chatham to hold a convention, she's talking about his meetings he held here in town at the BME Church, where he was ejected from, then the fire hall, schoolhouses, and most importantly at the First Baptist Church, which we saw earlier. At these meetings, John Brown discussed his plans to raid Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, where the United States Arsenal was held. They figured they could overthrow the government and put an end to slavery. So at the convention here in town, they also wrote a constitution to make up the new government after they overthrew it. John Brown's other goal for coming to Chatham was to gain men to go with him to fight at Harpers Ferry. Though there are accounts of other men from the area planning on attending, only one went with him, Osborne Perry Anderson, who we see here in this picture. Anderson was one of a handful who actually got away when the raid failed that day in Harpers Ferry. When Osborne Perry Anderson got back to safety, he would actually end up writing a book called A Voice from Harpers Ferry. And it's a first-hand account of what happened there that day and how and when it all went wrong.
When John Brown was in town, he ran out of money. And when he ran out of money, he went to Gunsmith Jones to get some money. And when he used this as collateral, he never came back and got it. So today we have John Brown's gun.
Our final museum display talks about the local artists, musicians, and sports teams from the area. So first up, we're going to learn about this lady right here, Artist Lane.
Artist Lane is one of our famous people from Chatham and Buxton. She was quite the artist. She went to California to do album covers and ended up doing her portraits, and that is what she is known for, and sculptures. Here you have a picture here where she is with Obama, President Obama, and here again with Mandela. Artist is still alive. She is about 96, 97 years old, and she lived in California, but she now lives in Detroit with one of her sisters.
We are so very lucky to have one of Artist Lane's sculptures right here in the city of Chatham. She sculpted our bust of Mary Ann Shadd, which can be found at our BME Freedom Park, and Artist is actually a direct descendant of Mary Ann Shadd. She would have been her great-great-great-aunt.
We also have one of Artist's portraits that she did of Rosa Parks.
When we talk about Chatham's Black history, baseball is one thing we can't leave out. This group that you see here is the Chatham Colored All-Stars. They were a group of all-black men who began playing together in 1932 at Sterling Park. And in 1933, a local businessman named Archie Sterling, who the Parks family is named after, helped get the team into the league. The Chatham Colored All-Stars rapidly gained popularity and the attention of local newspapers, who found the team to be highly skilled, dedicated, and thrilling to watch. In 1934, during the All-Stars' second year in the league, they won the provincial championship. They played the Penetang Shipbuilders from Penetanguishene, Ontario, in the final series and beat them 13-7, making them the first all-black team to win an OBAA title. The road to victory wasn't one that was easy for the team. After all, this was the 1930s in Canada, and segregation and racism was a part of the daily life of Canada's black citizens. The men on this team would regularly had to eat at out-of-the-way spots, often being served food out the back door of restaurants, and were regularly denied accommodation. Those in attendance at the games were also known to hurl racial slurs at the team. Throughout the years, players, coaches, and managers came and went, but one thing was for sure, the Chatham Colored All-Stars were a team to watch for in the Ontario baseball scene. The team continued to play together until 1939, when they had another chance at winning the OBAA championship title, but that final game was never played. Earl Flat Chase, one of the many well-known players from the team, should have been playing in the major leagues, but in the 1930s, the league still had a color barrier in place. One of his fellow teammates, Don Taburn, said, "Every park we played in, he had the record for the longest ball hit." Those parks included ball diamonds in Strathroy, Sarnia, Elmer, Welland, and Milton. Flat was also best known for his pitching abilities, ranging in speeds from 80 to 100 miles an hour. He not only pitched, but he could also play in the infield and even catcher when it was needed. Another well-known player on the team was Wilford Boomer Harding. He joined the Chatham Colored All-Stars when he was still just a teenager, making him one of the youngest players on the team. But baseball wasn't all he excelled at. Boomer was also known for his hockey skills. He even had a tryout with the International Amateur Hockey League and earned a spot with the Windsor Stratfords, a Red Wing farm team. He was the first black player in that league. He even was the first black player to skate at the Red Wings arena, the Olympia. The Chatham Colored All-Stars are such a huge part of Chatham's history. This past October, we even honored the men of these baseball teams by having a game played with all the players being descendants from the men on the team. And we're hoping that this is an event that we can put on again. Now, another well-known name from that team is actually Ferguson Jenkins Sr. Now, you might think that name is familiar because of his son. Fergie Jenkins Jr. would go on to actually be able to play in the major leagues, spending most of his career with the Chicago Cubs, but most importantly, born and raised in Chatham, Kent, and the first Canadian to be elected into the National Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. Those are just a few stories of the places, the people, and the things that make up some of Chatham, Kent's Black history story. We want to encourage you to maybe come out, take a walking tour with us in the spring or summer, and learn some more about this history. Thank you again so much for joining us on our virtual tour of the Black Mecca Museum today. And now Dorothy Wallace will take any questions.